السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. Amma ba'd, we start by praising God the Most High, the one to whom belongs all praise, the one to whom we return, the one who controls all affairs, the one who gives, the one who takes, and the one upon whom we rely. Glorified and exalted is He. And we send peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa sallam and his family and his followers until the end of time. Ameen. It's been a very jam-packed week. A lot of things have happened in this week, and it's necessary that we comment on a number of those things. So I will start off, number one, by a little bit of a story, a scenario, and then one of the major principles, the major principle that we have to fall back on when we deal with any sort of things that go on in our lives. And then from there we'll talk some specifics about the situation itself, and then some of the possible responses from ourselves internally, how we respond to things, and then to have some closing thoughts, inshallah. So the first is that this has been a long week. This week started probably for me appropriately enough with the trip to the graveyard with some of the youth. And that happened last weekend. And throughout this week, it's been a long week. So Monday, obviously, there was the attacks on the Boston Marathon. On Wednesday, I had a lecture in San Diego where there was a woman she blatantly said in the middle of the lecture, "I hate Islam." And then she wanted to continue the discussion, so we had an interesting conversation. Mostly she was talking and I was trying to get her to stop, but it was a conversation, I guess, nonetheless. And then Thursday, we prayed janazah for the father of one of my friends, and also a student in Azhar, as well as two of the sisters in the community, one of whom was very young, who died of cancer. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on them. And then last night, obviously, we had the events of last night with the shooting at MIT and then the shootout in Boston and the neighboring suburbs and everything that came as a result of that and is continuing to unfold. So there's been a lot of things that are going on. And then I got also a phone call this morning from one of the brothers in the community whose mother passed away. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on her. So it's been a jam-packed week. And in weeks like this, pretty much I think myself and probably the feelings of many others are very similar to the scenario that I wanted to mention, which was a conversation that happened by text last night between myself and one of the younger brothers in the community. And basically his question was, how do you deal with all this? How do you make sense of all of it? All these things are going on, all these things are happening, how do you do it? He's like, all the stuff that we do, all the things that we're engaged in, I just feel like throwing in the towel and saying, forget it. What is it? What are we all doing? What are we doing all this for? Because in the end of the day, it just comes back and something happens and it ruins everything that you're doing. And I think that question is actually probably on the minds of a lot of people, and that question really resonates. It resonated with me because it's a question that I ask myself very often. Why do we do what we do? What is the purpose? Why do we keep doing what we do? Why do we keep reaching out? Why do we keep being good to our neighbors? Why do we keep checking ourselves? Why do we build the relationships that we build? Why do we care for the youth? Why do we do all these things? We do these things, number one, because it's principle. It's not about the consequences of what this happens or that happens, which is what we're going to come to next. But I think the conversation itself was indicative of what many people are thinking. And it's indicative of a struggle that we go through as believers. So the question is not necessarily, who did it or who didn't do it, or are we going to get the blame for it, or whatever it may be. The question is, how do we as people of faith respond to the challenges that we see around us? Because right now it's what's going on in Boston. 5 years ago maybe it was something else. Next week it's going to be something else. Next month it's going to be somewhere else. If it's not in the United States, it's in Syria, it's in Burma, it's in Somalia, it's in any number of places of the world that are afflicted by conflicts. So there's always going to be difficulties, there's always going to be struggles and trials. And the question then is, how do we face those trials as believers? How does our faith influence the way that we deal with these things? So the first and foremost important principle is the principle of Tawhid. That in the face of all the craziness and changing and instability of the world, we have to recognize what Abu Bakr radiallahu anh understood very, very quickly after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in a hadith that there is no tragedy that will afflict my ummah like the tragedy of my own death. So he's saying that when I die, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying, when I die, this is the greatest tragedy that the Muslims will ever face. And in the face of that tragedy, people had different responses. Some people didn't know how to react, some people stayed quiet, some people were louder, some people dealt with it in different ways. And nobody really understood what it meant, how to deal with the situation, until Abu Bakr radiallahu anh came and he addressed the people. And he addressed them by saying, whoever worshipped Muhammad, then know, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that Muhammad has died. And whoever worshipped Allah, then know that Allah is living and He never dies. And this is the response the believer should have in the face of all trials. That in the end of everything, if we boil it down to its core, the real issue of all of this is that Allah does not die. Allah remains. Allah is an hayy. He is living. He is not afflicted by any of these things. He remains. He is our goal. So when we boil it all down, we come down to the issue of Tawhid. We come down to, at the chorus level, what does it mean to worship Allah? What does it mean to be founded in that worship? That it's not chaos, it's not mayhem, there should be some stability in the way that we approach life as a result of our relationship with Allah. And one of the beautiful examples of this was very touching to me when I first came across it, was a story which I mentioned before of one of the slaves early in American history when he was brought and shackled and taken to America, and he was a Muslim. And you can imagine being in your place, growing up, learning, living with your family, then all of a sudden being taken all across the sea in the horrible things that happen in the Middle Passage, and coming to a place that's completely different to you, and you don't understand it all, and if you even speak your language or your culture, you're going to be killed. And in the face of all of this, when he wrote in his diary about his experiences, he said, لا يصيبنا إلا ما كتب الله لنا هو مولانا فنعم المولى ونعم النصير. This verse from the Quran, he said, his response to all of it, nothing afflicts us except that Allah has already willed it to occur. He is our patron, and He is the best of those to seek help from, and the best of victors. That this is really what it boils down to. In another verse in the Quran, it says, وَقِيلَ لِلَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا مَا أَنزَلَ رَبُّكُمْ قَالُوا خَيْرًا. It was said to those who have taqwa, to those who have God consciousness, what is it that God has revealed to you? What is it that your Lord has revealed to you? Of course, this can be taken in the context of revelation, but it can also be taken in the context of the stuff that happens to us. All of the things that occur in daily life. What is the response of the one who has taqwa? The one who has this God consciousness? Very simple, one word response. قَالُوا خَيْرًا. Everything that He has revealed is nothing but good. It says, in the end of the day, we have to keep this mind, yeah, it's not what we like, it's not what we want. We don't like suffering, we don't like pain, we don't enjoy death or anything like this. But in the end of the day, we recognize that we are servants of God and we have limited capability. And our responsibility in front of that which we face is to do the best that we can. And after that, we leave it to God to reward us, inshallah, for the efforts that we put forth. In another case, it was said about the believers when they were going to a battle, actually, and the numbers that they were facing was so difficult, and nobody believed that it was even going to be possible, that some people were starting to have doubts. And they said, actually, this is their statement was that, no, this is what Allah and His Messenger have promised us. وَمَا زَادَهُمْ إِلَّا إِيمَانًا وَتَسْلِيمًا. And it did not increase them except in faith and submission. So everything that occurs to us, everything that we experience, we have to bring it back to this. And I mentioned this in the khutbah before when we talked about Tawhid, when we talked about this belief in Allah as a foundational issue. And we've talked about it the last time I was here as well. That if we put our focus in the wrong place, when we put our focus in the wrong place, everything else falls apart. But we have to reorient ourselves in the face of difficulties, reorient ourselves to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is getting at in a very famous hadith. For those, if there's any space, you can move forward. Jazakumullah khairan for the people who are in the back. This is what he's getting at in the hadith when he says, "Ajaban min amr al-mu'min." You know, how wonderful is this affair of the believer. Inna amrahu kullahu khair. that his whole affair is good. If he's afflicted with some sort of good thing, then he has gratitude and that's good for him. And if he or she is afflicted with a bad thing, then they have patience and it's good for them. Active patience, but patience nonetheless. So this is the concept that we have to come back to. We have to come back to this tawheed, we have to come back to this reliance and dependence upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which we'll come to again in the very end of the khutbah when we talk about some points to move forward. The second issue is obviously the situation itself as it unfolds in Boston. There's a lot of differing reports. There's a lot of things that are being said. So I just want to make a few principles. The first principle is that the situation is still fluid. It's still unfolding. And the way of the believer in face of such situations is to have some patience and detail in how they deal with the situation. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِنْ جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. O you who believe, if a corrupt person comes to you with news, تَبَيَّنُوا, then figure out what is the truth. Seek the evidences and figure out what the truth is and come to a proper conclusion as to the situation. Don't rush. Because what happens when you rush? You're going to afflict another people because of your own ignorance. This is the verse says. So it's very, very important across the board in any sort of issue that we're dealing with. It could be a major thing, it could be a minor thing. It could be an interpersonal conflict, it could be a family problem, it could be a work issue, it could be a piece of information that you receive from someone, it could be a news issue, it could be a major world international problem. All of these things need to be dealt with the same way. فَتَبَيَّنُوا. Wait and have patience and figure out and see what the truth is. One of the things that we're afflicted with, and Shaykh Musa Ferber mentioned this before, he said that one of the things that happens when events unfold is that we consume so much news that we get paralyzed. This information changes and that information, and it's coming and it's changing and it's updating and everything else. And at the end of the day, you're afflicted with despair, you don't know what to do, and you're paralyzed, and that doesn't do anyone good. So as the situation unfolds, we need to be very clear and very concerned and strict about the way that we accept information as it comes. The second thing that is important is that, I ask people how should we respond to this. Pretty much the majority of the responses where we shouldn't apologize. And I agree with that. You shouldn't apologize for something that you're not responsible for. And that's a general rule. That's a general rule. The second part of it though is that sometimes our response is such that we say we're not responsible for it. It has nothing to do with me. I, as a Muslim who's living in this country and doing good things and trying to be the best person that I can and taking care of my family, I don't have anything to do with what this person did or these people did. If they're Muslim, if they're not, whatever it may be. That's true. But at the same time, that should not lead us to callousness. That doesn't mean that we should lose the quality of mercy. We should still feel bad about things that happen. Just because it's not your fault, it's not the only time that you feel guilty, or that you feel sad, or that you feel upset, or that you feel pain and mercy for the people who have been afflicted by this problem. Just because you're not responsible doesn't mean you lose your heart. We should still have hearts. So this is a second principle that I felt need to be mentioned in this regard. Which brings us to the possible responses. So I think that as I'm talking to people, you get a number of different responses and possibilities that people how they react. Number one response is people react with fear. So their first response is, okay, if it's Muslims who did it, then that means that there's going to be a backlash upon us, and all of a sudden we're scared, we can't leave the house. One brother told me that he was told this morning he has to come home immediately and stay in the home if he wants to live in that home anymore. And he went home and he talked to his mother, and he tried to understand the situation and so on. So we shouldn't respond with absolute fear. Okay? There might be some things that happen, there might not be some things that happen. This is life. Just because we're extremely spoiled and blessed in where we live and the experiences that we have doesn't mean that life doesn't have trials and difficulties. So we have to, be aware of what's going on around us, which will come later. But fear is not necessarily a proactive response. Fear usually leads to silly consequences, silly conclusions, and lack of fruitfulness in the way that we deal with things. So fear should be avoided. Possibility number two is frustration. And to be very honest with you, I felt this was the immediate, not the immediate, but one of the things that I felt very early on. I felt extremely frustrated. You know, as a community, you try to do the things that you do, and you try to put a good image out there, and you try to interact with people, and you try to do your responsibilities that are your responsibilities as a believer. Not so that other people will like you, but because they're your responsibility as a believer, and you try to do them, and you try to deal with misconceptions, and you try to help people understand, and you try to do all these things, and then all of a sudden, and you know how many hours and the pain and the struggle that you put into it, and then all of a sudden something happens and it's all swept away. So the response is frustration. But that response actually shows that there's an issue with the first principle, which is Tawhid. The response of frustration shows that something's not right a little bit. Yeah, you're frustrated, but that shouldn't stop us from doing what we do. That shouldn't mean that we no longer do good deeds. That shouldn't mean that we don't understand the things that go on around us. It shouldn't mean any number of these things. We get frustrated, yes, but that's life. This is the way that life goes. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. We don't do these deeds that we do. This is why I said it's important that we focus on Tawheed. We don't do what we do in order to please people. Pleasing people is a consequence of doing the good things that we are supposed to do because we're believers. And if we're very strict about that principle, we shouldn't be paralyzed by that frustration. We'll feel it still, but we won't be paralyzed by it. The third is the whole response of don't apologize, which we already talked about already. The fourth is the loss of the sense of mercy, which we already talked about as well. And the fifth is very, very strong, which is we need to respond as Americans and be there to help, and we need to do these things. And they're very good and true meanings. But the question always remains, is that if that is founded in your belief as something that you honestly believe is part of your faith, then it should be happening before any incident occurs. It should be the way that you live your life. So it's an opportunity for us to reflect. If all of a sudden we want to do all of these things that we weren't doing before, so that people will like us, that's actually perhaps there's an issue in the way that we're looking at the situation. We should do those things. Don't understand me incorrectly. We should do those things. And I think that the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center set a fantastic example of how a community can respond to such a situation. They said we have 40 plus people who are trained professionals in medicine who are willing to go immediately anywhere where they're needed. This is immediate response of the masjid. But that's because this is something that's been in progress. They understand it, it's a part of their work, and so it's part of what goes on as a response to the situation, which again finds itself in the Tawheed. We do what we do because Allah has guided us and given us revelation to show us how we should be good to people. And that should be something that is always manifested and always acted upon. So I say this, and inshallah in the end we'll get into some closing thoughts. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Some closing thoughts very quickly. Number one is that, of course, in the case of any situation or any sort of level of instability and suspicion, especially directed oftentimes to our community, is that we should be aware. To be aware is not to be paranoid, okay? We've talked about before how the believer always has to fall in between. The believer falls in between these two. You don't want to be ignorant and just heedless and not knowing anything that's going on. At the same time, we don't need to fall into a level of paranoia and just absolute insanity. But in between somewhere is that you're aware. You know, if you're walking late at night in particular, maybe it's a good idea to go with someone else, especially sisters, to not, you know, just be aware of your surroundings and how you deal with things. And notice the stuff that's going on around you. Related to that is that if something happens that you find to be unfamiliar, it's okay to call the police and tell them. Especially if something happens at the masjid, someone looks out of, you know, something looks very strange. Now we shouldn't, again, fall into a place where we start questioning every single person that we don't recognize. But at the same time, we should be aware. So if something strange happens, then the police should be notified, and also you should let the administration of the masjid know as well. There was someone on Wednesday night that was seen around the masjid very late at night, kind of just walking around a little bit. And when he was approached, some of the brothers happened to still be here. When he was approached about it, he left. It's not something to be alarmed about. The police know. The police, from the first day that this happened, the police came. They said, we're sending extra patrols. We're going to be around. If anything happens, just, again, let people know. Don't just sit on it. The third is that we should be ourselves. In the end of the day, look, I'll give you an example. We have something to be proud of. The other day we had an interfaith meeting here on recovery. How do you deal with addiction and so on? And a Muslim spoke, and a Christian spoke, and a rabbi spoke. And afterwards, many people came up to the Muslim sister who was speaking, and they said, actually, your presentation was by far the most powerful. And this is not even something that we've really developed in a major way in our community. We don't deal with addiction. It's the hidden issue in our community. But still, we're able to present. Islam has something to say about this. Islam is something that's very powerful, that's very good, that's very beneficial. So we should continue to be ourselves in our relationships with people around us, engage people. We shouldn't shrink into and disappear. We need to exist. Allah put us on the earth to exist. We need to exist. The fourth point is that we need to act on principle. Again, you're nice to people because you should be nice to people. You care about your neighbors because you should be caring about your neighbors. Some of those we're slipping on. Yes, it's a chance to renew them. Take a new effort to re-engage in the world around us, inshallah. The fifth thing is worship. Okay, in the face of difficulties, we need to worship. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ista'inu bis-sabri was-salat. You who believe, seek strength and aid through patience and prayer. We have to pray. When times are bad, we always should fall to prayer. This is a test for us. We should know where we're at by this. If we're looking to everyone else, but we forget that we should pray 2 extra rak'ah and ask Allah to help us, that's a failure. So we need to increase in our worship. We need to increase in our, asking Allah to forgive us, asking Him to guide us, making extra prayers, giving charity, and so on. We need to increase in that worship. The last point is that most of the feelings that I have about this were mentioned already in what I have said. However, there's an article that I wrote for the OC Register that will be published on Monday, inshallah, in the Faith and Values section. I'll give you a summary of the article just as a closing point, because I feel like it's something that we need to reflect upon. The article is titled, what? Resilience and the Beauty of the Human Spirit. Resilience and the Beauty of the Human Spirit. So I took the angle of using the terrible events in Boston to reflect upon an overall theme. That overall theme for me is, how do we overcome despair? Because regardless of how you look at it, there's always ups and downs. One of the questions, many of you probably know, my wife is due in 6 weeks. One of the questions that I often ask myself is, what am I going to do with a child in this world? This world is absolutely insane. And I'm going to bring a child into it? How am I going to raise this child? How am I going to get them through school? What are they going to see in their life? It's very, very difficult. And you get over it because you reflect and you think about life and you think about all the beautiful things and you think about Allah and everything else. And then you wake up in the morning and you see what happened in Boston. And then you fall again. And you feel like, man, how do we keep moving? But that's the way life is. And then I opened an article, I saw 13 things that awesome things people are doing in light of Boston. Some people finished the race, they ran after they crossed the finish line, they ran straight to hospitals and donated blood. Local restaurants opened their doors and gave free food to people. A list came up on Google where people can put their housing information if anyone can stay with them, or if people need rides, they communicated with each other in that way. Even the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center received letters from neighbors and words of support from other congregations telling them, look, if anything happens in the backlash of this, if anyone blames the Muslim community, we have your back. They received a letter from a neighbor saying, I've lived in this area for a long time, and I know that this is not representative of the Muslim community, and anything that I can do to help you, I'm willing to do to help you. We can arrange people to walk with brothers, we can arrange people to walk with sisters, we can do whatever it needs to do in order to get past this. So the opportunity and the hope and the beauty still exists. And that is why we keep doing it. And that is why we have to reaffirm our commitment to Allah and reaffirm our commitment to our faith and continue to be objects that bring beauty into the world. Not hatred, not disgust, not enmity, not pain, none of these things. We need to be people who bring beauty into the world. Bring goodness into the world. And if we can do that, then we can move forward. Because that love will overcome the hatred, the hope will overcome the despair, and we will understand why it is that we keep going. So we have to do this, and we have to renew our commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Him to make us steadfast and to forgive us of our sins and shortcomings. O Allah, You are our sustainer, You are our supporter. Give us help and give us aid and give us wisdom in these tough times. O Allah, help those who have been afflicted by this tragedy and many tragedies all over the world. Help all of those innocent people who have been afflicted by pain and hardship. Give victory to those who are oppressed and give aid to those who are struggling. Feed those who are hungry and give shelter to those who need shelter. O Allah, increase us in knowledge and understanding and help us to be true to our covenant to you. Help us to be steadfast and help us to be of those who worship you in all that we do. These are tough times, Ya Allah. Help us in these tough times and give us guidance and give us tawfiq and make us steadfast on that which you expect from us and help us to seek your pleasure and your pleasure alone in all that we do. And give us the bounties and beauties and openings of true belief in the face of hardship. آمين. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا. اللهم بارك فينا وبيننا وألف بين قلوبنا. اللهم وحد صفوفنا وأعلمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا صالحا. اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان. اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان. اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان. اللهم بارك فينا. اللهم أعنا وثبتنا. اللهم آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. وصلى اللهم وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. وأقيموا الصلاة.